Hello everyone, your pal 6Speed here, and I know it's been a while since I've done a video. I've just been super busy, what with work and whatnot, and trying to get the boat up and running and ready to go. So now that it's finally kind of on the water, using it for this year and fixing the minor bits and pieces next spring before I get it out on the water. Yeah, I have a little more time on my hands, so today we're going to talk about alternative fuels in this lecture. So we're going to talk about the types of mainstream alternatives for gasoline as well as diesel fuel. We're going to talk about the fuel systems that run them, essentially, for the mainstream ones, that is. And we're going to talk about the advantages and drawbacks of our mainstream and even some of the non-mainstream fuels, as well as the fuel systems that behind them. So we have three mainstream gasoline alternatives that are currently in use. We have ethanol, which is generally blended with pure gasoline in various percentages. We have natural gas, which comes in two forms, the most common being compressed natural gas. And we have liquefied natural gas, which is starting to become a little bit more prevalent. And we have LPG or propane. LPG stands for liquefied petroleum gas. Everybody knows that one's what Hank Hill uses to run his barbecue off of. Okay, so the less mainstream alternatives that we really have, we have hydrogen and we have methanol. So let's start by talking about the less mainstream alternatives. We have hydrogen. So hydrogen produces nothing but water. That's the biggest advantage to it. However, storage is very difficult. It requires, basically the problem is that hydrogen has the smallest molecule of any element in the periodic table, so the molecules tend to actually leak through the sides of the tank very easily. It has to be kept at extremely high pressures, about 5,000 to 7,000 psi. And it's very hard to produce. It requires a lot of energy to produce, whether there's a couple of ways to make it. Electrolysis of water being one of them. Kiddie science experiment kind of thing, seen that a lot of times. Also, a lot of the time, it's actually created during the processing of crude oil by stripping the hydrogen molecules off of the crude oil during production of oil, gasoline, natural gas, etc. Fuel cell technology currently is pricey and is just not as efficient as some of the other alternatives right now, unfortunately. So that's kind of why hydrogen is not really that prevalent right now. Hopefully with the advent of better fuel cell technology, more efficient storage and stuff like that, and more efficient production of hydrogen, it'll begin to hopefully rise up, because it's really one of the only fuels that is basically produces zero carbon emissions when being burned. Now, the other one is methanol. Methanol is known as wood alcohol. It's produced using methane as a key ingredient, methane gas. It burns a lot cooler than gasoline. An purely alcohol-fueled motor, a lot of race engines run methanol. It's actually very hard to overheat because of the way that the fuel vaporizes. You ever poured any kind of alcohol, rubbing alcohol, something like that, on your hands and then let it evaporate, you'll find your hands get very cold. It's actually generally used in race vehicles. My wife and I love going to watch the dirt track sprint cars. They all run pure methanol in those things. So the advantages of methanol, it can actually be produced in a renewable manner using CO2, water, and electricity. It's got a very high octane rating, hence the fact why it's used in a lot of race vehicles. And it burns very slowly and at a much lower temperature. It's also easy to put out a methanol fire with water, hence the fact why it's actually very prevalent in racing applications if in the event that there was an emergency. It also burns cleaner than gasoline, less pure carbon emissions, so basically it leaves less deposits on the inside of the engine in that sense. So the disadvantages of methanol is it's very dangerous to your health. It actually contains formaldehyde. It's a lot more expensive than gasoline. and is highly corrosive to the fuel system. Methanol more so than ethanol, hence the fact why it's not really used and blended with gasoline like ethanol is. If you let methanol sit in your fuel system, it will turn the rubber components to jello fairly quickly. And currently it's a limited availability here in North America as a road fuel. You can more easily get it as a race fuel. It's got a very short shelf life. It's something called hygroscopic, which means it actually absorbs the moisture out of the air. And that's why a lot of people that run alcohol-based fuels in their collector cars, boats, stuff like that, lawnmowers even tend to have issues because the fuel and the water will actually separate, phase separate, and it'll form little puddles of basically rancid, acidic water at the bottom of the fuel tank. And that wreaks all kinds of havoc on your fuel system. So now on to the more mainstream alternatives, which is, number one is ethanol. Ethanol is generally made from corn or sugar cane. It has a higher octane rating than gasoline, and it is a renewable energy source because you can actually grow the corn or the sugar cane, harvest it, and then produce the fuel from it. Now, it's generally blended with gasoline. A lot of pumps that you'll see will say, a lot of gas pumps, when you pull up, have a sticker on them that says contains up to 10% ethanol. A lot of the tuner guys like to run E85, which is 85% ethanol and 15% gasoline, due to its high octane rating, the ethanol having a much higher octane rating than the gasoline. But more on that later. So basically E10 is offered at most fuel stations. There's very few fuel stations that offer ethanol-free gas anymore. It kind of depends on the area that you're in. E85 is used for flex fuel vehicles or for performance vehicles specifically tuned to run it. It's not a really good idea to run that in your regular vehicle. The fuel system doesn't have the capability to run at a higher volume to run the E85. So the advantages of ethanol is it's a renewable energy source. We have our high octane rating. It's a lot cheaper than gasoline, believe it or not. Now the disadvantages to ethanol, again, like methanol, is corrosive to the fuel system, not near as bad as the methanol. And it's got a lot less energy than gasoline. It requires about 30% more fuel to produce the same power when you're comparing pure ethanol to gasoline. It also requires a special fuel system in order to run more than 10% ethanol. The vast majority of vehicles will take a 10% ethanol content without any modifications. I think generally, after the early to mid 90s somewhere and beyond is easily capable of running 10% ethanol. Now, like methanol, it has a very short shelf life because of its hygroscopic properties. Again, it absorbs the moisture from the air and then does something called phase separates, where basically the water kind of precipitates out of the fuel and forms like a gel at the bottom of the tank. So, we're going to talk about a flex fuel system. This is the type of fuel system that can run up to 85% ethanol and anywhere in between. So basically, it's capable of running pure gasoline, E85, or any percentage of ethanol in the fuel in between 0 and 85%. It uses a sensor in the fuel line to determine the ethanol content of the fuel. And it has a higher volume fuel pump and injectors that basically the computer can adjust the fueling level because of the lower power output, the lower energy content of the ethanol. So essentially, it's able to deliver the more fuel required when you're running a higher ethanol content. So this is a diagram of a flex fuel system. Essentially, it's a closed-loop feedback system with your fuel pump drawing from your fuel tank, going through your fuel rail. This is kind of an older style system. This is from Haltech, which is an aftermarket tuning company. A lot of systems don't actually run a fuel return line like in this setup. But the ethanol content sensor is actually the heart of the system, which reports to the PCM, the vehicle computer or the electronic control unit. what the content of the fueling is, what the content of ethanol content of the fuel is, and can adjust the system accordingly to run at optimum. Without this sensor, essentially you're going to be stuck with a hard tune for E85 or a hard tune for gasoline. And if you had to use, say you were running on E85 and had to use gasoline in a pinch, you're going to run into all kinds of problems because it's going to overfuel the system just because the gasoline is obviously a different fuel. So next we're going to talk about natural gas. So basically we have, like we discussed before, our two varieties. We have compressed natural gas and we have liquid natural gas. So natural gas has a much lower carbon content than gasoline. So basically octane, which is the hydrocarbon chain found in gasoline, has 8 carbons and 8 carbons, 18 hydrogen molecules, whereas natural gas, or methane is basically the derivative of that, is only 1 carbon molecule with 4 hydrogens attached to it. So it's obviously it's a very short carbon chain, so we have much less carbon per molecule. The only thing is that natural gas, because it's a gas at room temperature, requires a special fuel system to run it. So our advantages of natural gas is it's a lot cleaner burning because we do not have as much carbon content in our carbon chains. So the lower content of carbon means that you have less oil contamination. You'll notice with a vehicle that runs natural gas, if you check the oil frequently on a gasoline running vehicle, as the oil ages, it will get darker. That's from the carbon that is contaminating the oil, the carbon, pure black carbon deposits that get stuck to the piston and stuff like that when you burn gasoline. You don't get that with natural gas. So you'll notice with natural gas, if you check the oil, it won't be near as dark after the same amount of time. So basically, because the carbon is one of the reasons why things wear out, the carbon is a very hard molecule, and it'll actually kind of scrape or chip away at the edges of the cylinder walls and at the piston rings. Because you don't have as much of that, your engine lasts significantly longer running on natural gas. So you basically end up with virtually zero carbon buildup running purely on natural gas. It's very inexpensive compared to gasoline by volume. So the disadvantages of natural gas: it can be expensive to convert your gasoline to a natural gas capable system. Natural gas is a very low energy content, again, because you don't have as long of carbon chains. It's always a trade-off. So basically your fuel economy ends up suffering drastically. Like with ethanol, you require a larger volume of fuel to produce the same amount of power. So you end up with a loss of engine power, essentially. Now, depending on your area, the fuel may not be as readily available as gasoline. Well, it obviously isn't as readily available. Only a select few gas stations in my area, in the entire area that I live in, which is quite a large area, carry natural gas, and I believe that they're kind of stopping doing that because not too many people have natural gas capable vehicles anymore. So CNG, compressed natural gas, versus liquefied natural gas. Compressed natural gas, you can basically go to a normal fuel station that carries natural gas. You probably have to get somebody to fill it for you, kind of like propane. Requires a certification to fill it, but there's really no specialized equipment for it. There's fewer parts in the fuel system compared to liquefied natural gas, which results in a lower cost. The only thing about compressed natural gas is because it's a compressed gas inside a tank, you don't have as much fuel volume for the same size of tank. So basically less fuel available when you have a full tank. Liquefied natural gas gives you a higher storage volume because the fuel is actually stored as a liquid, so you get much more fuel content per volume. However, it requires special storage vessels that are usually cryo-capable because natural gas has to be stored at a very, very cold temperature to maintain a liquid or a very, very high pressure. So it requires special equipment to fill the tanks. And unfortunately, in the area that I live in, at least, they're talking about doing a liquid natural gas expansion program. But right now, there's very limited fueling locations. And of course, you're going to need a lot more expensive components for fuel systems. So basically, you need special pumps. There are special pumps that are able to pump the liquid natural gas because it's at such a high pressure and such a low temperature when it's stored that just a standard run-of-the-mill fuel pump will not work. So the advantages, so that's natural gas in a nutshell. Now we're going to move on to LPG or propane, as Hank Hill calls it. Similar advantages to natural gas: inexpensive, low carbon content. Propane has less carbon content compared to octane, which is in gasoline. More fuel stations carry propane compared to natural gas. Just about anywhere you could fill a barbecue tank, essentially. In theory, could fill you up. The legality may or may not be questionable. A lot of places that fill vehicles with propane have their own dedicated pump. Kind of looks like a gasoline pump, but a little bit different. And like I said, it can be filled just about anywhere that can fill propane by volume. Here in my native country of Canada, we fill our propane tanks by weight, our barbecue tanks by weight. So you can't fill a propane-fueled vehicle like you can with a propane fill. It doesn't work here. That's it. You're just not allowed to. Propane's got a much higher octane rating than gasoline as well. So the disadvantages of propane: it's got a lower energy content like natural gas. Again, less carbon molecules in the carbon chain, which results in poorer fuel economy than with gasoline. Again, less engine power. But it does have a much higher energy content than natural gas does. So basically, that's all the fuels in a nutshell. Now we're going to talk about the fuel systems. So a dedicated fuel system basically runs purely on the fuel that it's converted to. So if I took my good old Dakota, which I love so much, and converted it to purely run on natural gas, took the gasoline system right out of it, that would be considered a dedicated fuel system. It can be fuel injected, although they are a little bit more difficult to affix to a vehicle. Generally done by the factory or factory authorized modification facility. I believe Roush was actually converting F-150s. I don't know if they still do. I'm going to have to fact check that one. Carbureted systems are quite easy to install for propane systems. A lot of aftermarket manufacturers can supply that. Usually an adapter plate that sits on a carbureted intake manifold. Very simple. Now, the only thing is, it requires you to have a readily available fuel source, because obviously you don't want to go out and drive off somewhere and run yourself low on fuel and not be able to fill it back up. So basically, this is a fuel-injected dedicated fuel system. In this case, would only really work for compressed natural gas. Now, we have a shutoff valve, which is basically a safety feature. It's able to stop the flow of fuel to the system whenever you shut the key off. The pressure sensor is basically a fuel level sensor. Since there actually isn't any liquid inside the tank, basically our fuel level is going to be a function of the tank pressure. The regulator obviously will bring the pressure in the fuel system down to a workable level so that the injectors can inject the fuel. So a fuel-injected propane or liquid natural gas system is a little bit different. Now, since the fuel inside the tank, even though it's under high pressure, is a liquid, we have a level sensor within the fuel tank, which obviously the computer is able to read. Now, next in line after the fuel tank is our vaporizer. So generally what it uses is hot engine coolant goes in, obviously cool engine coolant comes out, because what it's doing is it's actually heating the fuel to turn the liquid fuel into a vapor. An electric heater is a lot of the time used within the vaporizer because obviously when the engine is cold, you are not going to get very good vaporization. So you got to be able to turn the fuel to a gas somehow. After that is a regulator, and then after that is a shutoff valve, again a safety feature, so basically you're not leaking fuel out once you shut the engine off. And the regulator brings the pressure in the fuel system down to a workable pressure that the injectors can use. You can't actually inject liquid fuel, it won't work, and because it's so cold it causes a lot of issues if you were to run liquid fuel through the injectors. So by vaporizing it to a gas, it's much more easily workable. Now, a propane carb system works in much the same way, except instead of having all the complicated fuel injection stuff, basically what your regulator does is it brings your fuel pressure down to 0. So the mixing tower, or what we call our propane carburetor, is able to actually draw the fuel into the system via a vacuum using the Venturi effect. Now, that's going to be a whole other lecture, but basically as the fuel gets pulled through the mixing tower, the pressure drops as the air flows through it, and that's able to draw in the fuel because the fuel is at a 0 pressure, and the air rushing through is now at a negative pressure. Things like the flow from high pressure to low pressure, hence the fact why it's able to pull the fuel into the system. It's a very, very simple system to install. I believe you have to have it certified, but you can, in fact, install it yourself if you're so inclined to do so. But the system has to be inspected and certified and okayed before you actually fill it for the first time. So the other system is called a bi-fuel system. Now, this is switchable between gasoline and the alternative fuel. This is good for situations where alternative fuels may not be as readily available, so you basically don't maroon yourself out in the middle of nowhere. It's more costly than a dedicated fuel system. So basically the way a bi-fuel system works is 2 completely different fuel systems all mashed into one. So as you can see, this is an example of a compressed natural gas system with a gasoline backup, essentially. So basically what we do is we add the compressed natural gas system to the existing system. So basically a different intake manifold will go on to facilitate another set of fuel injectors. The PCM will get changed over, along with a toggle switch on the dash added, so the PCM is capable of knowing what type of fuel is going in and is able to adjust the fueling accordingly. So essentially, both systems are virtually identical. Like your standard compressed natural gas fuel system is virtually identical to the dedicated compressed natural gas system, with the addition of a gasoline system that's capable of being switched back and forth. So now, the second part of our lecture, we're going to start talking about diesel alternatives. So we have 2 main liquid fuel alternatives in a sense, or basically 2 main alternatives that we can put in the tank instead of diesel fuel. We have waste vegetable oil, also known as WVO, and we have biodiesel. And we also have a dual fuel LNG system. So let's start with, we'll start simple. We'll start with our actual diesel fuel alternatives. So waste vegetable oil is generally used vegetable oil from fast food restaurants, very readily available because they clean their fryers out fairly regularly, so they have a lot of waste oil. Sometimes they're just willing to give it away for free, so double check. If you have a diesel vehicle, you might want to look into this. So we have all different kinds of oil. We have soybean oil, canola oil, safflower oil, etc., etc. So WVO is full of food particulates. Now, if you were to use brand new, clean, fresh oil, like you could buy at your regular store, obviously it wouldn't be full of the food particulate. But because this is already used from fast food restaurants, you could probably bet that there's bits of fries and stuff like that in there. So our advantages to waste vegetable oil: dirty cheap. Very easy to come by. Your local greasy spoon should have a lot of it. and it's fairly renewable in a sense. And the best part is your exhaust smells like French fries. So the disadvantages of waste vegetable oil: it requires a separate fuel system, and I'll elaborate more on that later. It requires a fuel heater to prevent the fuel from gelling. Because vegetable oil is a lot more viscous than diesel fuel, it has a harder time being pumped through the system at a room temperature or at an ambient temperature. And of course, it requires an extensive amount of filtering before you dump it into your tank, or your fuel filter is going to be plugged up with lots of bits of French fries. So basically, this is the way a waste vegetable oil bi-fuel system works. So we have our diesel fuel, we have our waste vegetable oil tanks, and both of them go into a toggle switch or controller. So basically, the toggle switch is able to switch between diesel fuel and waste vegetable oil. And so, as you can see, our waste vegetable oil tank has a fuel tank / line heater that the hot coolant goes in and out of to basically heat the waste vegetable oil, to basically let it run a lot faster, like basically lower the viscosity by making it runnier. Now, there's only certain situations where you can use the waste vegetable oil. You don't want to be using it on a cold engine, and you do not want to be using it when you're going to shut the engine down. You want to switch it to diesel fuel, let it run for a while so that you can clear out your injectors and your injection pump or fuel pump or whatever fuel injection system your diesel engine has. That's a whole other lecture, but I'm trying to keep this as simple as possible. But if you let waste vegetable oil sit in your fuel system after that toggle switch there, it can end up wreaking havoc on the fuel system, because as it cools off, it could actually gel inside the fuel system, making it hard or even not starting it, hard to start, or won't even let it start at all. So our other alternative is biodiesel. Biodiesel is created using vegetable oil. Now, what I say is generally virgin oil. So when biodiesel is commercially made, it's generally made from oil that hasn't been used in a fryer. Now you can homebrew your own vegetable oil or biodiesel from waste vegetable oil. I've seen people do that too. Basically, you use methanol and lye to react with the oil, and this separates the fats from the combustible hydrocarbon chains. The fat molecules in the vegetable oil are what causes these severe gelling issues when running a WVO system. And so basically you end up with biodiesel fuel, and the glycerol, which is the fat molecules, will actually all fall to the bottom of the tank during the production process. So you drain it all out and you're left with pure biodiesel. And glycerin is the waste product. So our advantages of biodiesel: fairly easy to produce, and we can actually use algae to form the base stock, which is a very renewable energy source. That has come into light in recent years. So that's a huge advantage. It produces lower emissions than petroleum-based diesel fuels. So our disadvantages of biodiesel: like waste vegetable oil, but not near as bad, but still bad. Any kind of cold temperatures, if you're running pure biodiesel and it gets to freezing, you are not starting your engine. It'll be just about rock solid inside your fuel system. Now, vehicles generally require modifications for blends of more than 20% biodiesel, also known as B20. Like an ethanol-based fuel system for a gasoline engine, you need special lines and special pump and so on and so forth to run more than B20. Now, like ethanol in a gasoline system, it actually becomes corrosive over time, especially because of the lye, which is, I believe it's sodium hydroxide. Don't quote me on that one, though. It becomes corrosive to the fuel system over time. Now, it can't be used in high concentrations with newer engines equipped with a particulate filter system, because the carbon chains are too long and it doesn't vaporize and burn as readily. So when it undergoes the regen process inside the DPF, it won't regen properly and can end up causing causing a huge problem with the DPF and costing a ton of money. Now, the other thing is, because of the methanol, it produces formaldehyde when it's burned. So formaldehyde not being a gas essentially measured as a pollutant. So that is another huge issue. Again, same issue with methanol burning gasoline as well. I forgot to mention that earlier. So the other one is called a dual fuel system. This is actually different than a bi-fuel system. A dual fuel system means that it uses liquefied natural gas in conjunction with diesel fuel. It uses both fuels at the same time, whereas a bi-fuel runs either or, but not both. Now, a dual fuel system uses a dedicated injector for each fuel, so one for diesel, one for liquefied natural gas. So what it does is it starts a combustion cycle with a very small spurt of diesel fuel, and so once that starts to burn, momentarily after that it injects the natural gas, and that continues the combustion and the burn. So basically you're using a very small amount of diesel fuel and the rest natural gas to run the engine. So when you first crank it up, hit the key, it starts and warms up on straight diesel fuel and then switches to dual fuel mode once at operating temperature. So the advantages of a dual fuel system is you get much less emissions than straight diesel fuel. The fuel cost is a lot less. And again, same thing with the gasoline engine. We get way less carbon deposits than we do with straight diesel fuel. So the disadvantages of a dual fuel, as of right now, very few places that can refuel you with liquefied natural gas. The low energy content means you have a much higher fuel consumption. And you can't run it on straight diesel fuel alone. So if you run out of natural gas, you're up the creek. And it's just purely due to the technicalities with what's considered a dual fuel system. And all the disadvantages that come with an LNG fuel system apply. So this is a basic diagram of a dual fuel system. As you can see, it's actually quite similar to a standard gasoline LNG system. We got our vaporizer, shutoff valve, regulator, and our natural gas injector that is controlled by the PCM. And on the other side, we got our diesel fuel tank, pump, line, and its own separate injector. And both basically share the same combustion chamber. So that's about it. I hope that you enjoyed this lecture on alternative fuels, and I hope that you guys learned a lot. I definitely enjoyed talking about this. I do like new technology and all that kind of stuff. So I enjoy talking about alternatives and stuff like that, because I have a feeling that we're going to see a lot more alternative fuels in the future. Thank you all very much for watching. You can follow me on Facebook at facebook.com/6speeddakota, Twitter at 6speeddakota, Google plus 6speeddakota, and Instagram at 6speeddakota, can't forget that one, and always here on YouTube at youtube.com/6speeddakota. If you have any questions, feel free to post them in the comments. I enjoy answering questions. I usually answer them on my breaks at work. Any other related questions? Send me a message on my Facebook page. If I don't respond within a couple of days, feel free to send me another message. Sometimes my phone doesn't notify me, which makes me seem like I'm ignoring people, but for some reason my phone's been a little picky about that. So yeah, if you have any automotive related questions, I love answering questions and I love helping you guys out. So please feel free to ask them to me. Anyway, thank you guys all for watching, and take it easy, everyone.